Goddess. How are you? Do you remember me, Jasmine Bligh?
From the moment that Jasmine Bligh reopened television after the end of the war, outside broadcasts of all kinds became an essential part of every week's programmes. And as techniques improved and new equipment came into service, producers broke all kinds of new ground in their search to bring live pictures to the viewers at home. This series deals with those pioneering days of outside broadcasts. And this first programme is about a particular kind of outside broadcast which took those lucky enough to have television sets into a world of action, excitement and adventure.
I was never slow to take a chance to do something with the Air Force, and as most of us in OBs had been in the Air Force. And we tried earlier, I can't remember, I think it was very early in the 50s, to do a live transmission of pictures from the air at North Weald, and it turned out to be a monumental disaster.
Yes, I remember that well, with the old Bristol freighter. Many years ago now, we had a camera like this one. At the back of the Bristol freighter, I was sort of strapped in and given a parachute. But still, we got some good pictures from the air. We moved across London and looked at all the main points of interest. The problems which we did have on that particular run was more in getting the picture from the plane to the ground.
We had another go, and the idea was that we would try and make it realistic and not just get pictures from the air for nothing. But we went to a station in Norfolk which was one of its main roles was teaching people to fly blind. So we thought that we would show how a pilot was taught to fly, sort of covered up. And on the rehearsal the day before, it all went reasonably well. But come the day, the weather came right down, and it was for real. I mean, it really was a blind landing.
Well, there we are. We're turning now gently, running back towards base, above the overcast, in the beautiful eternal sunshine, which is the world of the airman.
Hello, Jungle 71, John D. Frank Baxter, are you there? We're now going to start the procedure to call you home and find out...
The outside broadcast crews were very much at home in this kind of environment. Most of them, Peter Dimmock included, had a service background, and the camaraderie of the combined op had carried through into the control van. Even so, television firsts like this were very considerable technical achievements.
1, still 355, forward and steady.
And approaching 3 miles from the runway, your altitude should be passing through 1,100 feet indicated. 100, you're heading.
And incidentally, I also remember this program because it was the only occasion on which I, as a commentator, also had control of the picture to which I was talking, because there was no airborne director. There were 2 cameras, as I say, one looking over the pilot's shoulder at the all-important instruments, and my shoulder too, incidentally, and the other camera was locked on in the bomb bay.
And here we come in over the lead-in lights, 100 yards apart. We're coming, there's the runway immediately in front of us. There's the white line seen through the bomb bay. Hold off, main undercarriage, touchdown now. Nose wheel still in the air. Even on that shot you can see how bad the visibility is. And there is the captain's view. Down goes the nose wheel, and down we come, straight and true, dead down the center of the runway and dead down the center of the flare path.
We were prepared to take a chance. The engineers felt that it would let down their professional reputation if things went wrong. We said, no, don't worry, the public are with us. If we make mistakes, they are not going to blame you. But I think at that stage, you see, the senior engineers in television, we used to call them the 3 Bs. The 3 Bs were much more worried what the director of engineering at Broadcasting House and Radio would say to them, because they saw that possibly their careers within the BBC at that stage might still depend on promotion back into radio.
Peter Dimmock and his team were a very lively lot with plenty of imagination, and they usually wanted to do more than we could manage, but that was probably a very good way round for things to be. It kept us on our toes, and we were keen enough to follow and to show that we could do what they wanted, but not always quite as quickly. I think in the long run we did it.
But I can remember saying to Bridgewater, soon after we'd done the first static relay from across the channel, which was a tremendous triumph. I wasn't on that, Calais. And I thought, what would be fun to do one on the moving Lord Warden ferry coming in. And I said to Bridgewater, Tony, come on, I want to do this. And Tony said, well, we don't know how you do this. You've got the ship's pitching all over the place. I don't know whether you can gyro the transmitter and this, that, and the other. And I said to him, that's your problem, not mine. I booked the ferry in 2 months' time, and McGibbon's given me airtime.
Of course, Bridgewater's engineers rose to the occasion. Barclay Smith was able to drive his entire outside broadcast unit onto this first roll-on, roll-off cross-channel ferry at Boulogne. And to the strains of the local fire brigade band, they set sail for England, transmitting these live pictures as they went.
Steady to go.
But with all live transmissions, the unexpected can suddenly happen. And one glance across the harbour bar prepared viewers and the television crew for a rough ride ahead.
So now we come to the entrance, and we are now beginning to rise and fall to meet the swell. On the bridge, everybody, including the captain, has suddenly been soaked to the skin. I don't know for the moment whether you can hear what I'm saying on this microphone. I wonder if someone will tell me whether I am at the moment audible.
As a seasick Richard Dimbleby valiantly carried on with his commentary, he was unaware that the same wave had knocked over one of the cameras on the deck and its cameraman.
We shipped it right on the bridge.
The ship just seemed to go haywire. We took a dive, came up again, and we just got practically washed off the side. The camera got washed over, I got pinned under the camera. Terrific hullabaloo going on while all this happened, but we did pick the camera up and we carried on.
Take a breather from the elements out here and get ourselves straight, because fortunately Danny Edgar, who is with us aboard, is down below somewhere in the ship, and he can talk to some others who are experiencing what we're experiencing. So from the bridge and from the deck over to below.
I also remember interviewing a continental coach driver, and he talked about going through Italy and crossing the Alps and one thing and another in his coach, and we were staggering from side to side trying to keep our feet, and I saw him going greener and greener and paler.
We couldn't get through the St. Gothard Pass through rains.
Look, Mr. Hicks, I think the best, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think the best thing we can do is to sit down before we fall down and hand back upstairs to Richard Dimbleby. Right?
And with great relief, they cut away from us, and he just shot over to the side of the ship. But it was a very memorable occasion.
And some observer who came into the control room with me, which had been built into the centre of the ship, said, oh my God, this is awful, oughtn't we to come off the air? Now, I'm a coward, totally physical coward at heart, but I intuit what television's about, and I said, don't be a bloody fool, this is exactly what we want, and if we can lose a second camera, I don't mind as long as it's in sight of the third.
We thought we paid great attention to this live element. Sometimes I look back and I think perhaps we allowed it to dominate us to the point where we might have made better programs if we hadn't have been afraid of inserting the odd film sequence.
Presiding over this go-getting bunch of producers with an intelligence and integrity that commanded everyone's respect was Simon Joly de La Binière, known to them all as Lobby.
And I think it was also part of this business of what we also called actuality, to persuade the viewer that he really was on the spot, that this wasn't something that had been recorded before and maybe edited and cleaned up and then put out to him when it happened to be a convenient time for him to view. That, fortunately, is possible as well from the result of the original actuality. But, and of course from films anyhow. But this seemed to us desperately important, and we were wanting to persuade people that they really were there.
You must remember that this was historically a repeat of the situation in radio from 23 or 4 years earlier. Then, the radio hadn't been able to do what it wanted to do because of the intransigence of the Luddites in show business. And it was exactly the same with television 23 years later, so they had to invent their own programs. This is why all that. Another reason for the rise of the live outside broadcast, which was just a created piece of television. Very successful. I suppose the most successful series of that kind was a thing called Saturday Night Out.
Outside broadcast. We're starting now.
To start with, there were two lunatics in charge of it. Peter Webber, who had all the crazy ideas, and Derek Burrell Davis, who had all the crazy solutions. He was actually the producer. And between the pair of them, they cooked up this incredible series of live programs. The whole object really was that at the time, recording was becoming the thing in television. We all know that today 90% of programs that aren't sport or current affairs are either on film or recordings. And Lobby said, look, we must have live outside broadcasts, and that's how it was born.
Well, the criteria were that it had to be a very good event which would stand live coverage for half an hour on a Saturday night. 7 o'clock on a Saturday night is quite a time to fill. So we searched the country, and we put these ideas up. But the trouble was we hadn't got enough units to go very often to the places where the programs were. We'd say we want to be at Hull, there's a marvellous thing happening. And our planners would say, well, you can't go to Hull, you'll have to go to Bristol, because that's where a unit is. So then we'd have to go to Bristol and find something.
Stand by.
Good evening, and as you join us tonight, once again, Saturday Night Out makes television history with this live outside broadcast picture you see now. Yes, it's helicopter to helicopter. Your first view through our new BBC Flying Eye. In this case, mounted in a Westland Whirlwind S-55 helicopter as we hover at 800 feet or so over the southern beaches of that popular West Country resort, Weston-super-Mare.
And Peter had so many ideas for things, most of which were about 10 years in advance of his time and our equipment. But I suppose he did jolly them on a lot, and we got all sorts of things. It was a very exciting program to do because you were never quite sure whether you were going to get away with it. Peter Webber organized the embarkation of a complete outside broadcast unit in the Dover lifeboat. As it was, we got some fairly lively weather in the Channel. And from the program point of view, I think the best thing we did was to go out to the South Goodwin Lightship and put a television set on board, which was their first television. We went out with one big camera anchored to the stern of the lifeboat, a generator for generating lights because it was at night time. And the skipper of this thing said, well, that's all right in it. He said, but that turnover, he said, that's going to act like a keel. He said, we should never be a self-righting boat again, which cheered us all up no end.
John Walker's really displaying his boatmanship coming alongside here.
Head starboard. Head starboard.
Giving his commands to his two mechanics, each of whom operate their separate engines. Now we're coming alongside her. There she is, the South Goodwin Lightship. Little ship in a big sea, only 200 tons of her. There's Alf Barry throwing the line there, one of the two seamen on watch.
Well, there we were, alongside each other, the two ships grating against each other in a very high sea. And the thing to do was to try and time yourself in your leap when the two decks were together for about 3 seconds, which I managed to do, ably shoved by one of the crew members.
And now, first thing to go, Sampson takes the camera. Cameraman. Brian, the stage, Ronnie Pantlin, the stage managers, and I'm going to take my microphone and follow on Captain Parkins. Captain Parkins, take the mic. Have it. Thanks a lot. That was fun, wasn't it? Great point.
Then, of course, was the dreadful business of getting this television set on board. And I clambered up, and there was this fellow, I think his name was Sampson, he must have been, because he was a huge man. And he got this set like a box of chocolates in his hand, and he kept passing me, and I kept having a go and missing it. He got fed up in the end. As it came up, he said, "Yeah." And that's when I was going in the Ogden. And two brave men clutched me by the belt and heaved me inboard. The only trouble was all my back muscles popped. And I was walking about like the hunchback of Dr. Down for a couple of days after that. And I got it in and down to the saloon in one jump. I often wondered whether the set ever did work after that.
I give you 3 guesses what it is, Jock. Books? Don't think so. Aubrey, what do you think it is?
Me, I should say it's a new wireless set.
Oh, new wireless. It isn't a wireless quite, actually.
Getting hot.
There we are. There she is. Well, now, Captain Parkins, take the microphone and say your party, please.
On behalf of the good people of Ramsgate, we'd like to present you with this television set and hope that it will certainly relieve some of your loneliness and worries out here.
It certainly will. Thank you, Captain Parker.
Well, there we are. And there's the people of Ramsgate are very anxious that you should know that they're sending some technicians out to rig it up before Christmas.
And thank the people of Ramsgate on our behalf.
Well, do they not? Well, you've done it yourself. They're watching, of course.
The first show from a submarine was in a Saturday night out program. I did several submarine trips, but the first one, which I can recall being a pretty, I won't say dangerous, but it was very unusual for someone who'd spent the war up aloft to be down below.
For the first time ever, you are looking in the control room of a British submarine 40 feet under the surface of the English Channel. Her commanding officer, Commander Higgins, is at the periscope looking at the sea and the surface of the sea above him. This picture comes direct from the inside of a submarine. And this is what Commander Higgins can see through his periscope. You now are looking through the periscope yourselves. And there in the distance is Her Majesty's frigate Grenville.
I am 10 degrees on his starboard bow.
Captain, may I interrupt for a moment?
Certainly.
What is the situation, sir?
The situation is the attack has just started, and it should take about 12 minutes from now.
Do you think you're well placed for the attack?
Well, we can't tell yet. It depends how he alters course.
Right, well, we'll get out of the way, but we'll be back later on. And now I'm going to go forward again, continuing our quick tour of the ship. And here we are in what is normally the ERA's mess, but which has been taken over by us as our control room. There's Dennis Munger in the center talking to his cameraman, the producer aboard, and up nearest to us is Jimmy Moon, the technician responsible for our presence here at all, who's been working like a Trojan.
It was carried out with one normal camera, which was up in the forward torpedo compartment, 2 experimental cameras, which we had in the control room, one of which was looking through the periscope, the other periscope, of course, being used for the aerials, antennas, which allowed us to run at periscope depth. And the third camera was on a monopod and operated by a very old friend of mine, another ex-aircrew guy, Bill Wright, who subsequently became the producer of Mastermind.
From live pictures beneath the sea to a transmission from the top of a mountain, An outside broadcast camera and commentator Winford Vaughan Thomas rode on the Snowdon Mountain Railway.
This is the last of the little cuttings before we turn the bend and the summit's in sight. And there you see it, with our cameraman perched on the very summit, on his special stand. He must be undoubtedly the highest man at the moment in southern Britain.
But this, in fact, was not a live transmission. That had to be abandoned because the summit was covered in cloud. But the outside broadcast unit stayed on the mountain and recorded these pictures the next day to be shown later. The following year, under a new title, Now, the same team continued to take their cameras live to the most unlikely places. In this case, to the top of the Forth Bridge.
If you were in that man's shoes, you would be, at this moment, 360 feet above the Firth of Forth, with a sheer drop down either side of that girder to the waters below. The girder, as you can see, knobbly with rivets often, wet with rain. And if you want to know how wide the girder is, well, just measure off in your drawing room 2.5 feet. That's the girder. There on the right hand of those two twin top points of the cantilever is our top camera position. If you could climb up to the top of St. Paul's, to the top of the cross, you would not be as high as those two chaps, the cameraman and Jameson Clark.
Oh, bell. Ready and bell.
At the Royal Navy's submarine training school at Gosport, commentator Bob Danvers Walker found that the only way to escape was up through 100 feet of water.
Right. This is my moment of truth now. Remember, all the way up. Breathe out. Ready?
Swim boys in attendance. They're at the bottom,
yes,
aren't they?
They're standing by the hatch to hold Danvers Walker, just to make certain that
there
he breathes out correctly. And there he blows out. And there are the bubbles, and they release him. Give him a quick spin to steer him up, and he's going
80
past
feet.
80 feet. 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 20, and here he comes up, 10 feet and splash.
Well done, Bob. Come on, this way, old man. Okay. This way. Jolly well done. Congratulations. Come on out. Take your nose clip off.
We could never have done the things in outside broadcasts if we hadn't been a team. We talk about our little internal squabbles with the engineers, that we were always pushing them. But the fact remained that when the chips were down, and particularly after competition arrived, which was the healthiest thing to happen to any of us, because we couldn't be complacent, was this tremendous team spirit from the very bottom. You know, where I began as a stage manager on the production side or as a junior engineer, right up to the bosses. In outside broadcasts, we had one objective, and that was to be the best.
Continuing television's close links with the services, 3 major programs were mounted with the Army, the Navy and the Air Force. They were what Peter Dimmock called the hammer blows of outside broadcasts. Each program lasted for more than an hour, and each involved 5 outside broadcast units all over the country, all contributing sequences. They weren't just action programs, they were live documentaries about the role of the armed services at that time, the manpower, the equipment, and the state of readiness. Now and Saturday Night Out didn't always send their men with the mic adventuring. They also covered live events like show jumping, circuses, and the last night of the proms, events which still feature in the calendar of outside broadcasting. But more than anything else, Now and Saturday Night Out are remembered for the simple, brilliant, crazy idea that kept viewers glued to their seats, like the live outside broadcast one night in 1957 from the Longmoor Military Railway.
Merlin, of the King Arthur class. Merlin was born in 1919 and was retired from service in 1955.
Ah, well, this really was Peter Weber at his best. We hadn't got anything where we could find happening, so we thought we must make something happen on this particular date. So Peter went off to British Railways and said, could he buy an engine? And they said, well, we've got a so-and-so class engine, enormous engine, which they're just putting down for scrap. And they said, you can have that for the price of the coal to get it to where you want to, and you must pay the driver. Then he went down to the Royal Engineers at Longmoor and said, how would you like to have a real train crash to practice on? And I could lay all this on for you. And they said, how blooming marvellous.
Okay, driver, take her away. You won't forget to jump off, driver.
A mile further down the same track. Now here, in a sense, is the spot marked X, where the accident will happen, where demolition charges have been laid. The train wreckers are behind the crest, with two men with automatic weapons giving covering fire. Now where is the train? It's not the coal that's making it tremble, it's the excitement here. It's terrific. Now, out of that belt of timber in the background comes engine number 30740 and three coaches belting down the track to meet their end in a mighty crash over the embankment. Nearly 200 tons traveling at 45 miles an hour and unmanned. They've lashed the whistle down. They've lashed the whistle down, and you'll hear her coming down there. Down she comes, closing the gap to where the Royal Engineer sappers have laid their trap. See that smoke? Here she comes. A line to be buckled and wrecked by high explosive, which will send her hurtling down the 30-foot slope into a snow and ice-covered marsh. Here she comes, vivid realism that brings to life those dramatic stories of special service and commando raids of the war. Now here is high drama in real life. It's terrifying. Now anything can happen in the final holocaust of twisted and torn metal. You've never seen anything like this before on your television. Now watch. What a grand old lady. Still on her legs. Well, you've got to take your hat off to her. Great heavens, what a fantastic sight. Still blowing a whistle.
Well, once again, Saturday Night Out has shown you things happen as they happen, when they happen, and where they happen.
Here's the last torch being brought to the Wembley Stadium. An escort of motorcycle police and cars round it, and in the centre, running very slowly and splendidly and escorted by four other athletes, the bearer, John Mark, the bearer of the Olympic torch.
And when you take it in the context that here was something brand new, a television service with no track record, a program of that magnitude, to move in, to try and make sense of it all, was really quite a concept.
The concept involved mobilizing just about every piece of outside broadcast equipment available. most of it pre-war, and setting up mobile control rooms just outside Wembley. Pictures from the stadium and the pool were relayed to a master control nearby. It was a big operation for a very small audience. Only 45,000 homes had television sets, and they were all in the London area. In the stadium, the cameras were Emitrons, used by the BBC since the service began in the 30s. Duncan Anderson was one of the cameramen.
As you can see, there are two lenses, one of which was the taking lens for the tube, and the other was a viewfinder lens. And because these two lenses are separated, there was a parallax error between the two, which made it slightly awkward for following subjects, because you had to have these lined up dead accurately. And also, this had a normal ground glass screen, optical viewfinder. One advantage, you got an image in colour. But the image, you may be able to see it, is upside down and back to front. So that when anybody set up, their head would disappear out of the bottom of the viewfinder. And this meant that you had to develop a technique to counterbalance this. It wasn't easy, but once you'd acquired it, everything was all right.
This was the camera that had been used for all outside events, and it certainly had its drawbacks. The single lens gave a fixed size of shot, and cameramen used to joke that they could get a nose or an ear in focus, but not both. They needed a good deal of light, something that couldn't be guaranteed on winter afternoons, and sometimes coverage of sporting events had to be abandoned. But into the Empire Pool, just in time for the Olympics, came a new camera. It gave a better, clearer picture in the right kind of conditions. The cameraman saw the picture he was taking on a miniature television screen, the right way up. And it had a turret of 3 interchangeable lenses instead of just one. So, using 2 cameras, a producer now had the choice of 6 different shots. But the gear was still far from perfect, as Alan Chivers recalls.
I was in the pool covering swimming on the 3-camera unit, 2 of which were on the swimming, and 1 had to be given up to provide coverage for an interview room. And the thought of covering international swimming on 2 cameras, one of which might well go US at any moment, is horrifying. And I'm very glad they got no recordings of those days to produce as evidence.
But what outside broadcasts really needed was a camera that could work in any kind of weather conditions. The answer came from America with the Image Orthicon.
I remember going with Alan Silvers to Mill Hill, and it was a very, very cloudy day, thunder threatening. And towards the end of the match that we were broadcasting, it really looked as though we might have to give up. But we had the Image Orthicon being tested on an outside broadcast on this occasion, rigged in a truck. And Alan and I went in. It looked as though the sun was shining as we watched the football with this Image Orthicon. It was such a contrast.
Parker, and a penalty. No, the referee signalling it hit him in the stomach. 20 minutes left for play. Bishop Auckland 2, Hendon 0.
The Image Orthicon became standard equipment at events like this Amateur Cup final. But viewers still found it wasn't always easy to spot the ball.
An enterprising manufacturer got in touch with me and said, had I thought of a different coloured football? And he brought along to my office 5 varying grades of football, from slightly above the dirty brown, a sort of orangey, yellow, and up to white. And we decided to experiment with this. And we took it, I think it was to Romford Football Ground, because in those days the only football we were allowed to cover for most of the year was amateur. And we also loved to incorporate the viewer in any of our tests. And we invited them to write in. We numbered them all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And asked them which looked best on their screen, which wasn't a very scientific test, but it involved them in the game. And the club concerned were cooperative enough to change the football every so many minutes. And it turned out that the white football made life a great deal easier for the viewer at home. We stuck a temporary snag in that the manufacturers found that the white football, for some reason, couldn't be coated in such a way as to stop the water being soaked up. So for a few weeks, we were very unpopular because taking a good high header, the footballer's neck tended to disappear into between his shoulders. But in fact, they got it right. And as far as I know, that was the beginning of white football as we see in all major league, professional and international football today.
Head of outside broadcast Slabinier and his assistant Peter Dimmock spent a lot of time trying to persuade the organisers of professional sport to open their gates to television.
The soccer chiefs were very anti-television. We'd actually televised one match live, Charlton against Blackburn, in 1947. But there was an uproar, and all the other league clubs said, no, we mustn't have any live soccer. I think it was, well, there were really two reasons. One was money, that I think television at that stage we couldn't have afforded to pay the kind of money that would have brought to the screen a thing like Monday Night Football, which is so successful in the United States in peak time.
Elsewhere, there was, on the whole, a slightly gradual, but a pretty helpful attitude with cricket, with football up to a point. But there I must admit we started with the amateurs. I mean, on the amateur side, you could probably get anywhere with your cameras.
But many professional sports were rarely seen on television. Organisations like the British Boxing Board of Control saw television as a threat, especially at the turnstiles, and they and others were far from happy about any kind of cooperation.
Taking a short rest while the referee counts, but he's up on 6, and that's too soon, I think. And then he goes flat on his back again.
There was an association formed called the Association Protection of Copyright in Sport. The chap behind this was Frank Gentle, who at that time was boss of the GRA, which ran the White City Stadium, and Haringey. Both those stadiums, a lot of very important events took place, which we wanted to televise. And we had continuing battles against the association. But by and large, we always seemed to manage to reach a compromise that was acceptable.
We were prepared to pay what we call facility fees. And then very gradually everyone began to imagine at least that a facility fee could involve £50, and so it grew. But still nothing like the size of figure that a promoter was anxious to get for his world championship fight, whatever it was. And it simply meant that you said we shall have 14 engineers, and let's assume that they'd have had to pay the £3 ticket, and that, if you worked it out, was £42, if that is right. And then you have to park a vehicle, and you round it off to something, and it was called a facilities fee, and not a fee for the right to broadcast.
They're all lined up, Blackpool in the dark shirts, kicking off for this 1953 Cup final, and away they go.
The facility fee for the Cup final started at 25 guineas, but by the 1953 final, it had gone up to £80. And by this time as well, the BBC was having to pay £1,000 for the rights to broadcast the match.
Out to the great maestro Matthews himself. And after 20 seconds, a corner to Blackpool.
The FA were more far-sighted in a way. They allowed us to do a limited number of matches. Initially, we did the second half of the Cup final, then we did the whole of the Cup final, and we did quite a few FA representative matches and international matches.
There's the man who's really fighting for his cup medal. Could he score the winning goal now, himself? It's there! Kerry! Kerry! What a final! There's the man, Matthews. At long last, he's done it. Someone's put 4 for Bolton. They've got the score wrong. They've put it 4 each. Good gracious me. Well, that's just how exciting it's been.
Fairly early on, one fundamental rule was established, and that whatever we did with multiple use of cameras, and the standard was 3, you should position them so that when you cut from one to the other, you didn't jerk your viewer out of a seat at one end of the stadium to a seat at the other end. So it meant bunching your cameras together so the line of sight was the same, and providing the variation by the different sizes in lenses. And that was fairly consistent in all sports.
There'd been cricket on television ever since outside broadcasting began, but it too presented problems over camera positions, as Anthony Craxton discovered at Lord's.
I couldn't get a camera looking straight down from wicket to wicket, which was, I felt, the essential for all cricket coverage. And I badly wanted to get a camera on the first balcony, the members' balcony, where all the elderly members used to sit in great state. And after 9 years of trying, the MCC allowed me to put a camera on this balcony on the condition that if the members, the elderly members, didn't like it, it would be removed at lunchtime. Well, in fact, the members were delighted and intrigued and fascinated by having a television camera there, and it remained there, and it remains there now. We always have one, in fact, I think 2 cameras on the central balcony there. And in all other grounds now, we're able to get cameras almost where we want. And I don't think there's any restriction now to the number.
See how that turned then? A very vicious ball by Morris. A very quick one. Morris might at least get a run out of his over, but no, he won't get a wicket. So it's another one to Bill Edridge, 55 to him. England 128 for 2. And 4 runs needed. Now, will this be got in 1 stroke, or... No, brilliantly fielded by Davidson. 2 balls to go this over from Morris. 4 runs to get. No, is it the Ashes? Yes, England have won the Ashes. And the race of all time, what a scene here.
His life in those early days was very different to what it is now, because we were all amateurs at the time. I mean, they'd done television cricket in 1938 here at Lord's and also in 1939, but no one remembered that. And so the commentators very much left themselves to find out how to do it, and there was myself. And we had 1 or 2 experts like P.G.H. Fender, who's still alive, God bless him, and Crusoe, R.C. Robertson Glasgow, and Aidan Crawley, and they were the experts, and we just had to go along. They were really concentrating on the 1 or the 2 cameras. They probably had 2 then in those days, and left us to ourselves. And we tried to develop some sort of commentary. And the one thing we were always told is, only talk when you can add to the picture, and we were left to, you know, work it out from there.
But in 1954, Le Binier issued a masterly document laying down the ground rules for all television sports commentaries. One instruction was build suspense.
Well, the direct thing of suspense interest was to persuade the viewer, if you like at cricket, that in the next over, if both of them scored 5 runs, he'd be the first person to have scored 100 centuries in Test cricket before he was 42 on a Wednesday, or whatever the thing would be. And all through sport, in particular, you can build this suspense interest and make the viewer at home, who can't calculate these things for himself or know them for himself, make him sit in nearer the edge of his chair.
Le Binier's ground rules were so comprehensive that they remain just as relevant today.
Well, I used to try to analyze these things and put them down, and I think, you know, I think people were quite kind about looking at the paper occasionally. They could still disagree with it.
Some sporting events, by their very nature, were difficult to cover. Until 1949, the boat race could only be partially followed from cameras along the bank. But then, engineers managed to mount a camera on a launch to follow the entire race. One of the first cameramen to be waterborne was Duncan Anderson.
Well, the camera was obviously at the front of the boat, or the sharp end, as it were, so that you could have an uninterrupted view of the boat race. And again, I remember on that memorable occasion when the Oxford boat sank, I was there right at the very start. It was obvious something was going to happen because the water was so rough. And incidentally, there was no photographic record of that sinking. The only pictures taken were from the television camera. And the following day, the pictures in the papers were taken off the tube. Nobody had any record of it.
And here you can see the Oxford crew sitting very low in the water. There's only 2.5 inches of freeboard on the side there, and with the waves they've been going through, I think they've taken a terrific lot of water in. Cambridge now running into rougher water as they come up to the end of the wall.
water is breaking right over Cambridge as well, but they are a good, I should think, 4 or 5 lengths ahead. What do you think, Playford?
Cambridge are having a much easier passage than Oxford, having shipped much less water at the start.
And Oxford are definitely sinking, I think. We come over onto the Oxford crew. Oxford are getting lower and lower in the water, and they definitely are sinking. Oxford have sunk. And there you have a very unusual view indeed of a crew in the boat race sinking. It hasn't happened since 1925.
Go ahead, Peter O'Sullivan.
And good afternoon to you, and welcome to the very windswept car home.
Finish with one, in a bit. Let's have a bit tighter at the start. Stand by to move. The flag's up. The flag's up. Move to your rowing position now. Hold it steady as you can. You can pull it wider now.
Pull down slightly, George.
A bit wider. Steady. Steady.
The dam must have fairly charged there.
Stand by to row.
He was pulled back and they're coming into the tapes and they're off. And they're off, and I should say...
On dry land, the moving camera was known as the roving eye. It could keep pace with the horses. This was the Lincolnshire handicap, and brought new excitement to the coverage of racing. People at home often got a better view than racegoers in the stands.
And here is Chief Barker leading him a tremendous dance with Chalk Stream and Offspring.
And keeping pace with the roving eye was another BBC van, the mobile commentary box of radio's Raymond Glendenning.
Now they're coming up 3 furlongs to go, and it is still
And
Chief
it's
Barker.
Whirlyburn in the centre.
The demands of racing coverage were not just technical, as Dennis Munger remembers.
Well, Royal Ascot was the holy of holies and the racing scene. And there was this morning when one of the cameramen was making his way toward his camera position to check out his camera, and in the opposite direction came the Duke of Norfolk, who of course was the Queen's representative at Royal Ascot. And he stopped this individual and said, "Where are you going?" And the man said, "I'm going to my camera position." And His Grace the Duke of Norfolk said, "Have you a pass?" The man produced the pass and said, "Yes, I have this pass signed by the Duke of Norfolk." The Duke took the pass, glanced at it, tore it up, and said, "You no longer have a pass. I am the Duke of Norfolk, and until such time as you come back with a collar and tie and suitably dressed, you cannot go to your camera position." And even to this day, it is laid down that all BBC personnel at Ascot, particularly the Royal Meeting, must have lounge suits, collars and tie.
And at the post, easing him up, a very easy winner, looking over his left shoulder, Charlie Smirke and Lord Fox with Seaplane second, then comes Napoleon Bonaparte third.
So, we came to the end of our television outside broadcasts for this coronation year from Royal Ascot. We shan't be televising the racing tomorrow afternoon because some of the equipment has to be rushed up to Scotland in time for the Queen's entry into Edinburgh next week.
As early as 1950, television began to bring together lots of sports, some of them rather obscure, in a magazine programme. And it was the task of producer Barclay Smith to develop the right mix.
But I had already decided that if it was going to get a good viewing audience, which it did, I would play it rather for light entertainment than totally for serious sport. So it had an awful lot of inbuilt competitions, cars rushing around, and within this, and it worked well, and it sounded rather nice. But one day, a young man up at Alexandra Palace called Paul Fox, who was then, I think, writing for the newsreel then, said, "Could I have a moment? Could I talk to you about a programme idea?" And so I said, "Yeah, sure, let's go and have a drink." And as he developed this idea, a cold hand clutched my heart because I could see this was the end of my TV sports magazine. But I said in my usual brutal way, "Yeah, I suppose it's got a future, doesn't sound too good to me, but you can take it to Dimmock if you want to," who was the total boss. And which, of course, he properly did. And that was, in fact, the start of the whole of that era of great sports journalism. And I recognised instinctively the moment he said it that he was on the more modern tack than the thing that I was doing.
Good evening. Welcome to Sports View. Tonight's programme ranges from racing to boxing, from football to skating. And that's really how it all began. We started it fortnightly, some trepidation. Things, of course, went wrong. A lot of things, fortunately, went right. Roger Bannister very conveniently did the 4-minute mile, I think, on our second or third edition, and we rushed him into the studio. And that helped to bring attention to the program. It was innovative, and I think the public went with us and enjoyed it. And again, we treated sport very seriously. We tried not, I mustn't mention newspaper names, but we didn't try to treat it cheaply, as some newspapers would for sensation. Though, of course, we weren't averse to the good scoop or the good sensational story, provided we believed it to be true and accurate.
A year later, in September 1955, came commercial television. An outside broadcast, like every other department at the BBC, had to learn to compete.
Well, I think once we realized that independent television was a fact, it had a tremendous impact on us, and particularly on OBs, because, of course, the first thing that happened was a raid, an attempted raid on our producers. But George Barnes was director of television then, and Ian Jacob was director general. And they agreed that we really must resist this at all costs. So they put a lot of our producers onto contract. And the next thing, of course, was sports contracts themselves. We had quite a few long-term ones, but it had been very difficult to wheedle money out of Broadcasting House for television, let alone for outside broadcast contracts and major sports contracts. But I said that we simply had to try and get the contracts, and was fully supported by Barnes and Ian Jacob. And this made a great deal of difference.
Peter Dimmock, anyhow, had a tremendous lot to do with our sport. And I remember our Director General, Ian Jacob, saying to him, now look, if you're really going to pay these competitive fees, what more is it going to cost? And Peter Dimmock said $250,000. And when it worked out, he was just about right. But we got our $250,000 and did the broadcasting.
It was reported at the time that I had an open checkbook. That was very far from the truth. You know, working in the BBC, that money is always very tight, and so are budgets. But it did mean that I could go out and talk to promoters in terms of extended term contracts. And we were able to hang on to all our major contracts.
When ITV started, they found that Dimmock had signed up almost every imaginable sport of any mass appeal except all in wrestling. And the ITV, I think, turned to ITV Wrestling rather in despair and were a bit mortified to find that their audience lapped it up.
There's a marvellous story about the final fee, which I don't know if it's true, but it's lovely, and Peter Dimmock won't mind me telling it. He went to Lord's one day to negotiate this fee, and all the old gentlemen were sitting around the table there in their cravats and things, looking very pucker, and Peter went in and said, look, gentlemen, you're all very busy, I'm busy, I'm not going to waste your time, the BBC even though is going through a hard time. All I can offer you is £100,000. It's no good me bartering with you. That's all I can offer. Can I put that on the table? And they said, Mr. Dimmock, we do appreciate your kindness in doing this. Would you mind going into the long room while we discuss it? Because obviously we can't make an immediate decision. So about 10 minutes later, they called him back. They said, Mr. Dimmock, we do appreciate how courteous you were. It was very, very kind, but cricket too is going through a hard time, and we simply couldn't take less than 120,000. He said, done, like that, and of course their faces dropped.
In the decade between the start of commercial television and the coming of colour, outside broadcasts of sport of all kinds increased in quantity, variety and quality. Some minority sports, like show jumping, became vastly more popular simply because they've been on television. As the techniques of outside broadcasts developed, and as more equipment became available, producers found they could go into greater detail. From pictures of just the last few holes of a golf tournament, cameras could cover play on every green. The television network had expanded to serve the whole of the United Kingdom, and with it went the technical ability to relay important events live from any part of the country. Wimbledon, a regular television event since before the war, later became the first sports outside broadcast in colour, a technical advance that gave a tremendous boost to televised sport. rugby league, for years popular only in the north of England, steadily gained a national following.
Boston must score to give it to Sullivan, and he did.
Television became important to many promoters, and in increasing numbers, the sporting venues made permanent arrangements to cater for the outside broadcast cameras. Sporting bodies which had been reluctant in the past, like the professional boxing authorities, eventually reached agreements that permitted a certain amount of broadcasting. Colour and the instant replay were shortly to revolutionise the coverage of sport. But no event could have better celebrated the achievements of the first 30 years of sports outside broadcasts than the final of the World Cup in 1966. England's win at Wembley was watched live by 30 million people in Britain and an estimated 400 million throughout the world.
2 goals each. There's 20 minutes of the game left. Yes. No. No, the linesman says no. The linesman says no. It's a goal. It's a goal. Oh, and the Germans go mad at the referee. This line, at the linesman who can only speak Russian and Turkish. Now then, is Höttges, the referee, looks at his watch. Any second now, it will all be over. 30 seconds by our watch, and the Germans are going down and they can hardly get up. It's all over, I think. No, it's... And here comes Hurst. He's got... Some people are on the pitch. They think it's all over. It is now. It's 4. And Charlton. And the players bring themselves down. 10 seconds to go. Hurst has got a hat-trick. Hurst has got 3. It's all over.